NASCAR thought it had already survived Smokey Yunick. By 1968, officials believed they understood his games, his attitude, his appetite for confrontation. They had rewritten rules, tightened inspections, and convinced themselves that whatever chaos Smokey once brought to the sport had been contained. That confidence lasted right up until the moment his Camaro rolled onto the track. Because this time, there was no noise, no spectacle, no obvious provocation. The car looked clean, proper, respectful, and that was the first sign something was very wrong. The Camaro didn't challenge NASCAR with rebellion, it challenged them with precision. Every line of the car suggested compliance. Every surface suggested restraint. Inspectors expected the usual ritual: measurements, notes, a few warnings, maybe a minor adjustment. What they were not prepared for was a machine that behaved as if the rulebook no longer applied once the green flag waved. The Camaro didn't overpower the field. It erased it. It cornered with a calm confidence that defied physics, carried speed where it shouldn't have, and made experienced drivers feel like they were chasing something that existed on a different plane of understanding. What terrified NASCAR wasn't that the Camaro was fast. Fast cars could be regulated. What terrified them was that nothing about it looked fast. The numbers didn't explain it. The measurements didn't justify it. Lap times arrived without drama, without effort, without the visible strain that defined performance in that era. The Camaro didn't fight the track, it managed it. And management, not speed, was something the rulebook had never learned how to police. Inside Smokey Yunick's Daytona Beach garage, the car sat quietly, almost mocking the attention it attracted. There were no hidden tanks waiting to be discovered, no crude violations begging to be exposed. Smokey wasn't hiding parts, he was hiding intent. He understood how inspectors thought, what they looked for, and more importantly, what they assumed. Every tube, every bracket, every mounting point was designed not just for performance, but for misdirection. The Camaro passed inspection because it was built to pass inspection. What it did afterward was none of the rulebook's business. As the races unfolded, panic spread faster than rumors. Rival teams accused NASCAR of losing control. Inspectors measured harder and found less. Officials argued behind closed doors about whether the Camaro represented cheating, interpretation, or something far worse. Because if the car was legal, and it was then, the problem wasn't Smokey Yunick. The problem was the system itself. The Camaro wasn't exploiting a loophole. It was exposing an assumption that compliance guaranteed predictability. Smokey Yunick had built a machine that didn't need to break rules to humiliate authority. It obeyed them perfectly, then proved how little they actually governed. Every lap was a message NASCAR couldn't silence. Every victory forced the sport to confront the same uncomfortable truth all over again, that intelligence, when applied ruthlessly and quietly, could outrun enforcement every single time. This wasn't just another controversial car. This wasn't just another Smokey Yunick story. This was the moment NASCAR realized it wasn't racing horsepower anymore. This is the story of Smokey Yunick's Camaro that NASCAR couldn't stop. The first time Smokey Yunick's Camaro rolled onto a NASCAR track in 1968, jaws dropped. Officials watched from the grandstands, notebooks in hand, expecting the usual game of numbers, measurements, and minor violations. What they didn't expect was a car that seemed to obey every rule on paper, yet refused to lose on the track. Lap after lap, it outpaced engines twice its size, corners like it had magnets under the tires, and pit strategies rendered irrelevant. This wasn't cheating, it was war by genius. And NASCAR had no idea what hit them. Inside Smokey's Daytona Beach garage, the black and gold Camaro sat like a calm predator. To any inspector, it looked ordinary. The dimensions checked out. The weight was legal. The engine cover could be lifted without revealing any hidden reservoirs. But Smokey's obsession wasn't with hiding parts, it was with bending assumptions. Every tube, every bracket, every mount was designed to mislead the eye. while delivering absolute performance. Legal, but illegal, some whispered, and that was exactly the point. NASCAR thought they controlled the rules. Smokey Yunick thought rules were suggestions. The first race of the season confirmed the nightmare. Drivers in Chevys, Fords, and Pontiacs watched helplessly as the Camaro dominated the straights and corners with a precision that seemed impossible. Crew chiefs scratched their heads. Lap times were anomalous. Pit strategies failed to account for the Camaro's efficiency. And the whispers began. There's something wrong. There's no way this is legal. NASCAR inspectors began their usual rituals. Measuring, weighing, probing. But the Camaro passed every check. Officially, it was legal. Practically, it was untouchable. Those close to the program later admitted that Smokey had redesigned the Camaro's fuel delivery, suspension geometry, and weight distribution in ways that defied conventional understanding. Every alteration was subtle, invisible to the naked eye, yet devastating on the racetrack. By using unconventional materials in hidden reinforcements and rerouting components to improve balance, the car exploited loopholes no rulebook had accounted for. It wasn't about bending metal, it was about bending perception, manipulating expectations, and exposing the limits of authority. The real panic didn't start on the track, it started in Charlotte. NASCAR headquarters received reports from rival teams who couldn't explain how the Camaro dominated while passing every inspection. Senior officials convened emergency meetings, debating whether to ban it outright, investigate every race retrospectively, or quietly hope it failed. But hope was in short supply. Every time the Camaro hit the track, it humiliated their oversight. Every lap was a statement. Intelligence can outrun enforcement, and authority is vulnerable to brilliance. For Smokey, the thrill wasn't just in winning, it was in proving the impossibility. Mechanics and drivers were part of a carefully orchestrated system where each component served a dual purpose: performance and misdirection. Junior Johnson, behind the wheel, often described it as a machine that seemed alive, responding to the track as if it anticipated moves before they happened. Opponents could only watch, powerless, as the Camaro rewrote what they thought they knew about racing. The first chapter of the 1968 season ended with a clear truth. NASCAR had met its match. The Camaro wasn't a car. It was an idea, executed in steel, rubber, and ingenuity. And for one man, that idea was bigger than any rulebook, any inspector, any sanctioning body. Smokey Yunick had just reminded the racing world that sometimes the smartest weapon is the one that looks completely innocent. Smokey Yunick wasn't born to follow rules. He was born to break them and then prove he never actually had. By 1968, he had become a living legend in the stock car world, half mechanic, half strategist, half ghost. His reputation alone made competitors uneasy. Crew chiefs whispered, "He's not building cars. He's building nightmares." NASCAR officials approached every inspection like a war council, and even then, they knew he was 3 moves ahead. The Camaro itself was a reflection of Smokey's mind, calculating, relentless, and impossible to predict. Every curve of the chassis, every angle of the suspension, every line of the fuel system was designed to mislead the human eye while maximizing performance. To an inspector, it looked like a Camaro built by the book. But under that sheet metal, Smokey had invented a system so cunning, so audacious, that it rendered every regulation meaningless. Every rule had a loophole. Every limit had a blind spot, and he had found them all. Inside the Daytona Beach workshop, his team worked like soldiers executing a secret mission. Mechanics weren't allowed to question, only to follow. Tubing was measured in fractions of an inch. Metals were chosen not for cost, but for performance and concealment. Every iteration of the Camaro was tested in secrecy engine runs in the dead of night, suspension tweaks on deserted tracks, fuel systems examined under microscopes. What looked like chaos to an outsider was, in fact, military-grade engineering discipline. Smokey's genius wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. He understood how NASCAR officials thought, how they measured, how they assumed, and he exploited that. Every inspection was a dance. The Camaro passed with flying colors, but each component delivered a performance advantage that no one saw coming. Officials began to doubt themselves. Competitors began to fear the invisible. And the Camaro became more than a car, it became a symbol of authority, challenged and embarrassed. Junior Johnson often said the car felt like it had a mind of its own, and he wasn't wrong. The secret modifications to weight distribution and suspension allowed the Camaro to corner like it was on rails, while the engine ran smoother, harder, and longer than anyone thought possible. Fuel efficiency was flawless. Acceleration was relentless. And yet, every measurement Smokey had to submit satisfied the rulebook. It was legal, but illegal in every way that mattered. The first major confrontation came at Charlotte. NASCAR inspectors descended on the pits with clipboards, calipers, and suspicion. They measured everything: ride height, wheelbase, fuel capacity. They inspected carburetors, weighed axles, and even looked for hidden tanks. But every single check came back compliant. The Camaro had been engineered with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the audacity of a bank robber. Smokey watched from the sidelines, cigarette in hand, a faint smirk on his face. He didn't have to say a word. The car spoke for him, and it shouted, "You are powerless." Rumors began to spread. Teams accused him of cheating. NASCAR debated rule changes. Engineers tried to reverse engineer what they could see, but the most important parts were invisible. Tubes disguised as braces, hidden fuel channels, weight moved to imperceptible points. Every bolt placed for performance and deception. Each innovation wasn't just clever, it was untouchable. And each victory deepened the panic among the ruling bodies who realized they could not stop what they could not even fully comprehend. By the end of Chapter 2, one truth was undeniable. Smokey Yunick had created a Camaro that didn't just win it, humiliated the system. Every lap was proof that intelligence could outmatch enforcement. Every victory forced NASCAR to question whether rules were controlling the sport or if brilliance had already slipped past them entirely. The war was no longer about horsepower, it was about authority, foresight, and audacity. And in the shadows of Daytona and Charlotte, Smokey Yunick was laughing. It happened at Daytona, under the blistering sun and the roar of engines that could shake concrete. Smokey Yunick's Camaro rolled onto the track, black and gold gleaming, and the whisper started immediately. Crew members from every team leaned over fences, binoculars in hand, eyes scanning every inch of the car. They were looking for flaws, loopholes, evidence of cheating, but what they saw only made their blood run cold. Nothing. Every line, every panel, every bolt appeared textbook perfect. And yet, the car moved with a precision and aggression no Camaro had ever shown. The first lap was routine. By the second, panic began to set in. The Camaro didn't tire. Tires didn't overheat. The engine didn't falter. Fuel consumption was perfect. Junior Johnson, behind the wheel, barely touched the steering, yet the car clipped the apex of every corner, accelerated out of turns like a predator, and seemed to anticipate every movement of the competition. By lap 5, officials were scribbling notes frantically. They measured, they calculated, they argued, but the data didn't lie. The car was doing the impossible. Back in the pits, NASCAR's hierarchy was in chaos. Inspectors and officials huddled, red-faced, pointing at clipboards like generals planning a counterattack. "It can't be legal," one muttered. "It shouldn't exist," another replied. But the numbers confirmed it. Every measurement, every calculation, every regulation had been obeyed, and yet the Camaro was untouchable. It was a masterstroke of audacity, a violation of expectation rather than law. Meanwhile, Smokey's garage was a theater of quiet confidence. Mechanics moved deliberately, almost ceremoniously, making adjustments only for efficiency, not compliance. Smokey leaned against a workbench, cigarette dangling, eyes scanning the track. He didn't need to shout or gesture. Every lap completed, every position gained, was his declaration. You are powerless against a mind that thinks beyond the rulebook. The panic escalated further during pit stops. Competitors scrambled, trying to predict how the Camaro managed fuel so efficiently, how it cornered so aggressively without sacrificing tire life, how its engine could stay alive and angry lap after lap. Engineers dissected photographs, cross-referenced weights, studied carburetors, measured chassis flex, but every path led to a dead end. It wasn't a cheat they could catch. It was genius too deep to touch. Rumors turned to accusations. NASCAR's internal meetings became battlegrounds. Some wanted immediate disqualification. Others urged caution. We can't prove it, one director admitted quietly. But we can't let it win either. Threats of rule rewrites were drafted, emergency memos circulated, and inspectors were sent on reconnaissance missions to observe every trackside move. Yet for every attempt to constrain the Camaro, Smokey had already anticipated it. Every loophole NASCAR tried to close had been preemptively countered. The tension reached its peak when Junior Johnson returned from a pit stop with the Camaro's engine still running perfectly, despite an unplanned refueling procedure that should have violated regulations. Officially, it was legal. Privately, it was a nightmare. Smokey had taken rules meant to contain ingenuity and turned them into a stage for audacity. The car wasn't just winning races, it was rewriting the psychology of NASCAR enforcement. By the time the checkered flag waved, the damage was done. Competitors were humiliated, NASCAR officials were shaken, and the legend of the illegal but legal Camaro had been cemented. No paper, no measurement, no inspector could undo what had just happened on the track. The game had changed. Authority had been challenged. And the world of stock car racing had been forced to confront a truth it wasn't ready for. A single mind could outthink the system, outsmart the sport, and redefine what it meant to be untouchable. The day after the Daytona debacle, NASCAR headquarters in Charlotte resembled a war room. Phones rang endlessly. Clipboards were shredded. Memo after memo detailed emergency rule proposals, each more desperate than the last. We can't let it happen again, one official barked. It's not just a car, it's an idea, and ideas can't be policed. For weeks, committees met in secret, trying to draft regulations that could contain what Smokey Yunick had unleashed. Every time a rule was proposed, engineers returned with reports showing that Smokey had anticipated it, sidestepped it, and laughed quietly while the sport scrambled to catch up. Teams across the paddock were in chaos. Ford and Pontiac crews dismantled every engine, every chassis, desperate to reverse engineer the Camaro's secrets. Rumors swirled of spies in Smokey's garage, of bribed mechanics, of threats whispered in parking lots. Yet the truth was simple. No one could recreate the magic. Every adjustment, every hidden modification, every calculated line of fuel and airflow was orchestrated in a symphony only Smokey fully understood. And that fact gnawed at the egos of NASCAR's best and the pride of America's racing manufacturers. The legal system tried to intervene. Officials debated disqualifications, fines, and bans, but each proposal fell short. Officially, the Camaro obeyed the rulebook. Privately, it mocked it. NASCAR's inspectors, once the ultimate arbiters of fairness, were reduced to spectators, forced to witness a car that had broken their sport without technically breaking a law. Corporate sponsors fretted. Rivals seethed. And Smokey? He remained calm, almost invisible, letting the chaos unfold like a maestro watching an orchestra of panic. Some believed that NASCAR tried to sabotage the car directly. Leaks suggest parts were misreported, inspections delayed, and subtle intimidation used against the pit crew. Those close to Smokey later admitted that every attempt failed. Every bureaucratic hammer swung against the Camaro landed on air. The man who had built it had already disappeared behind another layer of ingenuity. untouchable in every measurable sense. Yet the legend only grew. The Camaro became the benchmark for cunning, the standard against which every future rule-bending car would be measured. Journalists called it the ghost machine, competitors called it unfair, and historians later described it as a turning point in NASCAR's history, the moment when cleverness eclipsed horsepower, and when rules were shown to be vulnerable to audacious genius. Smokey Yunick didn't need victory laps. His legacy was in the panic, the rewriting of regulations, the whispered fear among mechanics, and the realization that a single man could operate above the authority of the sport. The illegal but legal Camaro was not just a car, it was a statement. Innovation could not be contained, ingenuity could not be policed, and brilliance, once unleashed, could never be banned. Decades later, the Camaro's blueprints, pit notes, and photographs are still studied in garages and workshops, but no one has fully replicated the mastery. The uncomfortable truth remains: NASCAR couldn't stop it, and in that failure lies the lesson they tried to bury. Smokey Yunick didn't lose the Camaro on the racetrack. He lost it in conference rooms, behind closed doors, surrounded by men who understood exactly what had happened and were terrified of what would happen next if they allowed it to continue. By late 1968, NASCAR had stopped pretending this was about fairness. The Camaro had crossed a line no car was ever supposed to cross. It didn't just win races. It made inspectors look foolish, manufacturers look slow, and executives look powerless. Every lap it ran legally was another reminder that the sports authority rested on assumptions, not control. And those assumptions had just been shattered in public. The response was political, not technical. Rules were rewritten in language so tight it strangled innovation. Inspection procedures were expanded beyond reason. Gray areas were sealed with blanket bans. Nothing in the new regulations mentioned Smokey Yunick or the Camaro by name, but everyone knew exactly who they were written for. This wasn't regulation. It was containment. The sport wasn't trying to fix a problem. It was trying to prevent another one like him from ever existing again. Officially, NASCAR claimed progress. Privately, many admitted defeat. Those close to the decision later said the Camaro forced their hand in a way no protest ever could. You can argue with a cheater. You can't argue with a car that passes every inspection and still humiliates the field. Smokey hadn't broken the rules. He had revealed that the rules were never enough. The Camaro quietly disappeared from competition. No dramatic ban, no public scandal, just an environment where it could no longer exist. That was the lesson. In NASCAR, you don't have to be illegal to be erased. You just have to be inconvenient to power. Smokey Yunick didn't fight the outcome. He never begged for clarification. He never tried to preserve the car's place in history. He had already made his statement. The Camaro was never meant to survive. It was meant to demonstrate something, and it did. That intelligence, when applied without fear, could outrun enforcement. That authority only works as long as innovation stays predictable. Years later, engineers would argue over what the Camaro really did. Fuel delivery theories, weight distribution myths, suspension geometry debates. Some truths were confirmed, others were never proven. Smokey took many of them to the grave, but the exact details stopped mattering because the impact was undeniable. After the Camaro, NASCAR never allowed that much freedom again. The sport didn't evolve naturally, it tightened, and that tightening told the real story. History prefers villains who cheat and heroes who follow rules. Smokey Yunick fit neither role. He didn't cheat loudly enough to be condemned, and he didn't comply quietly enough to be celebrated. So the sport did what institutions always do with men like that. It buried the discomfort and rewrote the narrative. But the truth never fully disappeared. It lived in the rule changes. It lived in the fear of gray areas. It lived in the way innovation suddenly became suspect. The 1968 Camaro proved something NASCAR never wanted written into history: that the greatest threat to control isn't rebellion, It's understanding. And once that kind of understanding appears, no rulebook can ever fully put it back in the box. By 1969, NASCAR thought it had survived Smokey Yunick. Officials believed they understood his games, his appetite for confrontation, his appetite for bending authority. They had rewritten rules, tightened inspections, convinced themselves that whatever chaos Smokey once brought to the sport had been contained. That confidence lasted right up until the moment his Camaro rolled onto the track. And this time, there was no noise, no spectacle, no obvious provocation. The car looked clean, proper, respectful. That was the first sign something was very wrong. Because what terrified NASCAR wasn't that the Camaro was fast, it was that nothing about it looked fast. Every line suggested compliance, every panel suggested restraint. Inspectors expected ritual, measurements, notes, maybe a warning. What they got was a car that, the moment the green flag waved, refused to lose. Lap after lap, it erased the competition, cornered with precision that defied physics, carried speed where it shouldn't, and made experienced drivers feel like they were chasing something that existed on a different plane. Inside Smokey Yunick's Daytona Beach garage, the Camaro sat like a calm predator. There were no hidden tanks, no blatant violations, no desperate tricks waiting to be discovered. Smokey wasn't hiding parts, he was hiding intent. Every bracket, every tube, every mounting point was designed not just for performance, but for misdirection. The Camaro passed inspection because it had to. What it did afterward was none of the rulebook's business, and that was exactly the problem. As the season unfolded, panic spread faster than rumors. Rival teams accused NASCAR of losing control. Inspectors measured harder, found less. Officials argued behind closed doors. Was the Camaro cheating? Was it merely interpretation? Or was it something worse, a legal car that made enforcement irrelevant? Because if the Camaro was legal, and it was, the problem wasn't Smokey Yunick. The problem was the system itself. The Camaro wasn't exploiting loopholes. It was exposing assumptions that compliance guaranteed predictability. Every lap the Camaro led was a message NASCAR couldn't silence. Every victory forced the sport to confront a truth it never wanted to face. Intelligence, ruthlessly applied, could outrun enforcement. This wasn't about horsepower, aerodynamics, or tires. This was about foresight, cunning, and audacity, executed flawlessly in steel, rubber, and precision. Junior Johnson, behind the wheel, described it best. The car felt alive. It anticipated corners before he did, balanced weight before the laws of physics demanded it, managed fuel and momentum as if it had its own mind. Engineers tried to reverse engineer it. Officials tried to draft emergency rules. Every attempt failed. The Camaro wasn't breaking laws, it was rewriting expectations. Every move, every lap, every victory humiliated authority without technically violating it. By mid-season, NASCAR had crossed a line it could not ignore. Rulebooks were rewritten. Inspections expanded beyond reason. Gray areas sealed with blanket bans. Officially, the Camaro obeyed the rules. Privately, it mocked them. The sport wasn't trying to fix a problem anymore, it was trying to contain a genius. Smokey Yunick had demonstrated that authority only functions when innovation is predictable, and the Camaro was anything but predictable. The car quietly disappeared from competition, not because it was beaten, but because it had become inconvenient to power. No dramatic ban, no public scandal, just a recognition that some machines, some minds, cannot coexist with rigid control. Smokey Yunick didn't fight the outcome. He never begged for clarification. He never tried to preserve the car's place in history. He had already made his point. Intelligence applied without fear could outrun enforcement. Authority, no matter how meticulously structured, could be rendered powerless by foresight. Decades later, engineers still debate the Camaro's secret. Fuel delivery tweaks, weight distribution myths, suspension geometry rumors. Some truths were confirmed, others taken to the grave. The exact details no longer matter. The impact is undeniable. After the 1968 Camaro, NASCAR never allowed that much freedom again. The sport didn't evolve naturally, it tightened, and that tightening tells the real story. History prefers villains who cheat and heroes who follow rules. Smokey Yunick fit neither. He didn't cheat loudly enough to be condemned, and he didn't comply quietly enough to be celebrated. So NASCAR did what institutions always do with men like him. It buried the discomfort, rewrote the narrative, and tried to contain the memory of brilliance. But the truth never disappeared. It lived in the rule changes, in the fear of gray areas, in the way innovation became suspect. The 1968 Camaro proved something NASCAR never wanted on paper, that the greatest threat to control isn't rebellion, it's understanding. And once that kind of understanding appears, no rulebook, no inspection, no authority can ever fully put it back in the box. Smokey Yunick didn't lose the Camaro on the track. He lost it in conference rooms, behind closed doors, surrounded by men who understood exactly what had happened and were terrified of what would happen next if they allowed it to continue. The Camaro didn't just win races, it humiliated the field, embarrassed inspectors, and left manufacturers scrambling. It was legal, untouchable, and yet completely unstoppable. And in that quiet domination, it left a lesson for every competitor, every official, and every historian who would later look back. Brilliance cannot be contained. Ingenuity cannot be policed. And sometimes, the smallest, cleanest-looking machine carries the loudest statement. Smokey Yunick's 1968 Camaro wasn't a car. It was a manifesto, a warning, a revelation. And the world of NASCAR, forever changed, would never forget that one quiet, precise, untouchable machine that taught the sport its limits. If you want the real story behind the car that NASCAR couldn't stop and the genius who made it happen, subscribe.